Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Father Mitch Packrell. Welcome to Threshold of Hope, a program where we go through the writings of the church. And just want to mention that today is the feast of St. Cyril of Jerusalem. He's born around 313, just about the time, as a matter of fact, the very year that the persecution by the Roman Empire ended at the Edict of Milan, and he died in 386. He is especially known for his catechetical teaching. It's so cool. Every time I go to the Holy Sepulchre Church, I'm reminded how he would teach the catechumens as they gathered around the tomb of Jesus. That was his classroom in front of the tomb of Jesus. And you can still be in that area where he taught. But if you're interested in what he taught, just look up Cyril of Jerusalem at the EWTN.com library, and you'll see his writings, especially his teaching to the catechumens. It got written down, and probably by scribes, and it's very, very interesting to see how what we still teach, he was teaching back then. All right, now we are ready to get into the document we've been working on. This is still part of what we began for the year of faith, and this document is called Faith and Reason, Fides et Ratio, by Blessed John Paul II. And you can get a paperback copy of Fides et Ratio by going to EWTN's Religious Catalog. Just go to their website, which is EWTNReligiousCatalog.com, or you can call them 1-800-854-6316. Or if you prefer, you can download a free electronic copy of the Encyclical by, again, going to EWTN.com, go to the document library, type in Fides et Ratio, and download it into your computer for free. And either read from your computer or print it out, but that's not free. You have to pay your own paper and ink. Now, of course, we'd like to have you involved in participating in the show. You can do like all these folks have done from across the country today. We have them as far as Washington State, all the way over to the East Coast and to Pittsburgh and other places, and the Republic of Texas. We have a few folks from there. So we'd love to have you come and join us and take part. Or you can also send us a question by email by writing to threshold@EWTN.com. Or if you wish, you can also call during this live broadcast, which is on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time Zone. And then adjust, of course, to your own time zone. And the number to call during the broadcast is 1-800-221-9460. If you are outside the United States, or if you're right here in Birmingham, then you can call 205-271-2980. And I'm happy to get your questions in the second half of the show. Now, we are on paragraph 54 of Fides et Ratio, in which, again, this chapter is talking about the ways in which the church has intervened in various questions about philosophy. And we'll see why. As a matter of fact, he mentions in our own century, though he wrote this in the 1900s. So in the 1900s, as well as we talked about some of the earlier ones last week, but he mentioned that the church has warned about some problems with philosophies that are dead ends. So he doesn't use the word dead end, that's me using that. What one of the concerns that he had is against rationalism. rationalism puts human reason by itself and doesn't have any room for faith. And what we've been saying is that reason has its proper place, faith has its proper place. They go together. And he mentions, for instance, Pope St. Pius X, who had written against the errors of modernism, which was a theology that was becoming popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And he wrote very strongly and clearly against it and required all theology professors to take an oath against modernism. Though, while I was once in class, one of my professors said, I took the oath, but I crossed my fingers. Wow, what were you, in first grade? You know, when you did that? Don't take the oath if you don't mean it. But at any rate, you know, the Pope John Paul mentions that the basis of modernism were different philosophies. Now, we don't, as a matter of fact, we don't see them too much anymore. But one of them he calls phenomenist. Now, you don't hear about that. You know, they fell away. But the phenomenist philosophy is that you just look at the phenomena, the things that appear, and just let them be. You don't really give much pulling together of what they mean. Another was agnostic. You know, now that we see plenty of. That's on the rise. I remember one man, I was working out at a gym, and this guy said to me, you know, he had a name that was obviously Jewish in background. He said, yeah, I went to Sunday school to learn about Judaism till I was about 11, 12. But, you know, I stopped going because I became an agnostic. And I said, he was obviously in his late 50s. I said, have you figured it out yet? He said, no, I'm still an agnostic. I said, sir, that is intellectual laziness. You know, that, you know, you should figure this out. As a matter of fact, the closer you get to the end, you really ought to have a good answer. And going around saying I'm agnostic, which is a great word out of Greek. Greek gnosis means knowledge. Agnosis is unknowledge, or what we call by its Latin equivalent, ignorance. So basically, agnostics are going around bragging, I'm ignorant and proud of it. You know, I don't think that's the best way you want to brag about your attitude towards God when you meet up with Him. Also, there was an immanentism. Immanentism was a philosophy that God is in, you know, right up so close. He's in and He doesn't go beyond us. He's just here in the present, and we can deal with that. That's why Pope St. Pius X wrote an encyclical, which again, you can get the whole thing from EWTN.com. It's called Pascendi Dominici Gregis from September 1907. And he wrote there in paragraph 40, to penetrate still deeper into modernism and to find a suitable remedy for such a deep sore, it behooves us, venerable brethren, to investigate the causes which have engendered it and which fostered its growth. You know, causes seem to us to be reduced to two: curiosity and pride. Curiosity would be the problem in this sense. We're not just talking about cats being curious. They have their own fate when they're curious. But, you know, it's rather, you know, oh, this is something new. As a matter of fact, I remember, it's not so much anymore, but some years ago, people would say, not that a certain idea or a certain action was good or bad. They would just say, well, that's different. Different from what? Are you just curious about something that's different? And say, well, I've never seen it before, so it's different. Is there nothing else to be said about it? I mean, just being different is not enough of an evaluation. Is it different from normalcy? Is it different from good behavior? Is it different from moral behavior? What's it different from? But that was a way for people to be just curious about everything. And, you know, partly behind this criticism is that the serpent made Eve curious about the wrong fruit. Did God really tell you not to eat that? So you just become curious. And then, of course, pride is that I know better than anybody else. That's typical. Again, it starts at age 2, but it goes well on into other stages of life. The Pascendi Dominici Gregis continues in paragraph 40. Curiosity by itself, if not prudently regulated, suffices to explain all errors, but it is pride which exercises an incomparably greater sway over the soul, to blind it and plunge it into error. And pride sits in modernism as in its own house, finding sustenance everywhere in its doctrines and an occasion to flaunt itself in all aspects. No, truly, there is no road which leads so directly and so quickly to modernism as pride. Years ago, there was one of the earliest critics of the New Age movement. Her name is Constance Cumby. And she mentioned how this encyclical, Pascendi Dominici Gregis, was one of the best statements against the New Age movement you could find. And in the New Age movement, you see exactly this. Curiosity about all sorts of forms of occultism, about various forms of nonsense, and great pride, as you see in Shirley MacLaine and others, where it said, I am God, I am God. Falling exactly for the temptation of the serpent to Eve, who said, if you eat the fruit, you'll become like gods. And they fell to the same temptation. And St. Pius X accused the modernist heresy of the same. Also, we have to see that there was a strong and clear Catholic rejection of Marxism and atheistic communism. So that we see, for instance, in the Encyclical by Pope Pius XI, Divini Redemptoris, back in 1937. As a matter of fact, so good a critique of Marxism that Marxists used to use it, taking out the parts criticizing them, but he described Marxism so succinctly and so accurately. Marxists would use the Pope's statements, not tell people where they got it from, the Pope Pius XI, and then use to say, and this is what we should believe. But they skipped the parts where he took them apart to shreds. And in paragraph 29 of Divini Redemptoris, Pope Pius XI wrote, society is for man and not vice versa. Whereas in Marxism, man exists for the state and is a functionary of the state. This must not be understood in the sense of liberalistic individualism, which subordinates society to the selfish use of the individual. Now, he said that's one other extreme, where it's the opposite, or it's the question that was posed by President John Kennedy. Asked not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. A question that's forgotten by so many people who are trying to find, what can society do for me? What am I going to get out of it? What do you got for me? Any goodies you got for me, etc. And the Pope's not talking about that the individual is absolute, but neither is society absolute. Only in the sense that by means of an organic union with society and by mutual collaboration, the attainment of earthly happiness is placed within the reach of all. So that if folks do cooperate honestly and, do what we say in our Declaration of Independence, they have an inalienable right to the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Doesn't say that the Declaration will guarantee that you're happy, but you may pursue happiness. And you have to do so in society, and you may not do so in a selfish way. Pope Pius XI went on in paragraph 29. In a further sense, it is society which affords the opportunities for the development of all the individual and social gifts bestowed on human nature. These natural gifts have a value surpassing the immediate interests of the moment, for in society they reflect the divine perfection, which would not be true were man to live alone. But on a final analysis, even in this latter function, society is made for man, that he may recognize this reflection of God's perfection and refer it in praise and adoration to the Creator. So think about the role of society. You don't give yourself your own education. You don't learn how to speak by yourself. Children who do not have contact with other people do not learn how to speak. And oftentimes they die fairly early. These are some of the feral children who have been found over the years. Whereas you learn to speak from the society around you, your parents, your siblings, your relatives, and so on. And the rest of your education comes not only from other people, but from the whole history. You don't have to reinvent mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, and so on. You learn what others in the society of human beings have learned and passed on. So you do need to be in society, but you are not a tool of society. Each individual also has his or her own inherent dignity. And so we have to keep that, just the fact of life. Humans are born into a society at the very minimum of their mother, and at best, their whole family, and the rest of their society. And we cooperate together. That was one of his critiques of atheistic communism over against many others. And by the way, it was not but another year later that he also wrote a stinging criticism of Nazism in his encyclical Mit brennender Sorge. It was actually written by Pius XII, who was still Cardinal Pacelli. And they wrote it in German, which Pacelli knew extremely well, and got it to the German people in German so that they could, warn them that Nazism is not acceptable any more than communism is. They were enemies to each other, but both were opposed to the truth of God and Christianity. And the popes certainly warned against it. Later, speaking of Pope Pius XII, he wrote Humani Generis, which warned about certain mistaken interpretations of ideas like evolutionism. This was something that you saw with sometimes devastating results coming from Charles Darwin. And we want to make a distinction. The biological understanding of the evolution of species is one thing that biologists need to study and figure out. There's quite a bit of disagreement with Darwin's proposal of the theory from biologists on the basis of biology. But evolutionism is something else. That is a philosophy that talks about how not only did animals evolve and human beings evolve, and that's a bit of teaching, but also society evolves. And typically in evolutionism, people who teach that believe that they are the cutting edge of evolution, so their ideas are the way things are going. This is very, very prominent right now as we see a lot of people saying, I was just looking at some blogs, different Christians, the church itself and so on, have to go along with the redefinition of marriage, of family, etc., because this is the way things are changing. It's inevitable. Without paying attention that if you use evolutionism, you could say that the saber-toothed tiger and the mastodon were the cutting edge of evolution at one time. But they don't exist anymore. So just because something is modern doesn't mean it's going to be a success. Or that it's, in the case of human life, it's good. And so he criticized that. And also existentialism, a philosophy that is all over the place. There's so many different kinds of existentialism. But basically, when you take a look at some of the two main proponents of existentialism, Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre, you see that they saw life as meaningless, or in the case of Heidegger, man only can find meaning as he faces death in the eye and stares down at death and accepts that he's going to die, that man is a being towards death. That's how he defines man. Whereas Jean-Paul Sartre said that there's no meaning except in being free. And that was something he certainly was in his relationship with his mistress, to whom he could not be faithful. So, and then historicism. Historicism is the belief that there's no truth except in its own historical era. And then when history changes, so does truth. Well then, now how does that make sense? Matter of fact, again, this is just like the relativism. If you believe this, then you're saying my idea of historicism goes across history, and therefore it is the truth about all history. In other words, you're saying that there's no truth, absolutely, except my truth that everything is historically conditioned. So I know the one true thing, and none of you know anything that's true. That's the criticism I would suggest. Now, Pope Pius XII made it clear that these theories had not been proposed and developed by theologians. They came from outside of the church. As you see in paragraph 2 of Humani Generis. He said, it is not surprising that such discord and error should always have existed outside the fold of Christ. Now, what kind of error and discord? I'll give you an example. Charles Darwin, in his second book, The Descent of Man, applied his theory of evolution to society. And he taught that people of African origin are a species in between human beings, who are white, and apes, who are not human beings, and that they are therefore not human. Now, when this was translated, and the idea, I don't know if Adolf Hitler actually read it, or if he simply picked up the idea, because the book was translated into German fairly early on. And the idea was floating around, and the idea that there are groups who are subhuman was taught by Darwin. And Hitler simply applied the teaching to the mass execution of Jews, who he considered subhuman. And so you can see where such evil can be, taken from this. And by the way, it certainly would go along with Margaret Sanger, the foundress of Planned Parenthood, who very much wanted to eliminate inferior peoples, people from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Africa, Hispanics, because there are too many of them and they are inferior. And she could, I don't know that she read Darwin, but she could say, well, Darwin proves it. And Darwin wrote, by the way, that they should be weeded out like you would an inferior breed of cattle. That's his expression. So, that's why the Pope said this is not Christian. It's not tradition at all. He added that the errors of this kind should not simply be rejected, but should be examined critically. As we see in paragraph 9, Catholic theologians and philosophers whose grave duty is to defend natural and supernatural truth and instill it in the hearts of men cannot afford to ignore or neglect these more or less erroneous opinions. We have to examine what is the problem. That's why it's good to read Darwin's Descent of Man, to understand what he taught and where the error lies. For instance, and again, Darwin could not know. Africans share the same basic human DNA as the rest of the human race. But scientists hadn't discovered DNA in his day. So he created a myth that they were subhuman. In paragraph 9, Pope Pius XII wrote, rather, they must come to understand these same theories well, both because diseases are not properly treated unless they are rightly diagnosed, and because sometimes even in these false theories, a certain amount of truth is contained, and finally, because these theories provoke more subtle discussion and evaluation of philosophical and theological truths. So we need to understand modern philosophies. We may say, oh, I don't want to think about that. You got to think about it. Because if you don't think about it, then other people will do the thinking for you, and it will not be to your advantage. They will do the thinking for you, to your harm, and to their own advantage. Ask anybody who lived in the Soviet Union under the commissars. You think the commissars wanted equality for everybody? No, they wanted more equality for themselves. And that they were in charge so that they could enjoy a good life. And there was no concern for the rest of people. So this is why we must understand these things. In accomplishing its specific task in the service of the Roman Pontiff's magisterium, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith has more recently had to intervene to reemphasize the danger of an uncritical adoption by some liberation theologians of opinions and methods drawn from Marxism. So you see in Pastor Bonus, which was written back in 1988, Article 48, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith wrote, the proper duty of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith is to promote and safeguard the doctrine on faith and morals in the whole Catholic world. So it has competence in things that touch this matter in any way. And fulfilling its duty of promoting doctrine, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith fosters studies so that the understanding of the faith may grow and a response in the light of the faith may be given to new questions arising from the progress of science or human culture. So this is something the church wants to do. Yes, there are new developments, but we are going to examine them and take a look at them from the perspective of our faith, from the faith in Jesus Christ. And we will evaluate and not say, well, Marxism isn't as bad as Nazism. Perhaps, though I don't think that would be a correct statement, because the Nazis were complete amateurs at murder compared to atheistic communists. The Soviets executed 61.9 million of their own citizens. And the Nazis executed 10 million. Now, this is a horrible kind of contest. But you can't say, well, this one is worse than the other, so I'll take the other. No. Evil is worse than good. And we don't compare evil to evil and choose the evils, but we try to compare evil to good. And that's why in Libertatis Nuntius, 1984, which means announcing liberty, the congregation wrote, impatience and a desire for results had led certain Christians, despairing of every other method, to turn what they call a Marxist analysis. Their reasoning is this: an intolerable and explosive situation requires effective action, which cannot be put off. That was what the liberation theologians were saying. We have to do something now. And that effective action presupposes a scientific analysis of the structural causes of poverty. And so they want to understand, why is South America in particular filled with so many poor people? Well, it's part of the structure of the way things were going. So, and then they said, Marxism now provides us with the means to make such an analysis. They say, but the term scientific exerts an almost mythical fascination, even though everything called scientific is not necessarily scientific at all. That is why the borrowing of a method of approach to reality should be preceded by careful epistemological critique. In other words, epistemology is the study of how do you know that this is true? All right? How do you know it? And before you say Marxism is a good scientific critique, how do you know that? On what basis are you saying that? So that was what they were saying. And that this preliminary critical study is missing from more than one theology of liberation. In other words, and I was in South America. I was working in Peru back in 1975. And I met a variety of folks who were practicing liberation theology or promoting it. And I found myself no more impressed by their Marxist analysis or solutions than I did by the right-wing military government at that time. And when I heard one liberation theologian who said at the Priests' Council in Lima that we have to prevent Mother Teresa from bringing her nuns to Peru, to help the poorest of the poor, because by helping them, she will be delaying the pain and easing some of the pain, and therefore delaying the revolution we've got to have. And I found this out from the sisters who were picking babies out of garbage, who were going, one old man had no legs, and his family dumped him out of his wheelchair into a garbage dump. They went to the garbage dump every day to pick up people. And if doing that act of mercy and charity is delaying your revolution, then I guarantee you that your Marxist revolution will be just as evil as anything that Vladimir Lenin or Joseph Stalin or any other such revolutionary tried to accomplish. This is an example of where an idea and a revolution is more important and places society ahead of suffering individuals. And that is what the church critiques. Yes, we want to help the poor and change things that we can so that the poor have the same opportunity to pursue happiness as anybody else should have. But we don't want to encourage suffering for the sake of a revolution. That would be something contrary to our faith and morals, contrary to the person of Christ. So that's why we disagree with it. All right, we're going to take a break. And we'll come back in a couple of minutes, and we will deal with your questions and questions from our studio audience and emails. So please stay with us. Thank you very much, and welcome back. Again, we want to thank all the folks who have come here from all these different places, and we would love to have you come and join us as well. If you can be, if you have a chance to come down into Birmingham and be part of our audience, call our pilgrimage department at 205-271-2966, or you can also check Pilgrimage Department at the website EWTN.com, and they'll give you information about scheduling of masses, programs that you can be in the audience for, and tours, and information how to get up to Hansville and all that. All right, let's now take a caller from Robert. Hello, Robert.
Hi, Father Mitch. How are you?
Fine. Where are you from?
New York.
Great. The city or the state?
The state and the city. New York, New York.
Okay, there you go. Yeah. If you're from the city, of course. So what's your question?
Well, Father, we're now in the Lenten season approaching Easter. And, of course, before we get to Easter, there's Passover. Now, as everyone knows, Passover commemorates God killing the firstborn of every creature in Egypt to induce Pharaoh to let the Israelites free and go.
Right.
And this is, deemed a holy act which God said must be commemorated for eternity by the Jews, and Jesus himself, of course, commemorated. Now, we just left the Christmas season. Now, at the end of the Christmas season, there's the murder of the innocents, where Herod killed every male under 2 years old. Now,
in Bethlehem.
In Bethlehem, correct.
Right.
Now, that act we look at as a horrible act. Herod was an evil butcher and is terrible, whereas Passover is a holy act by God to commemorate it. Now, if you were an atheist or an agnostic and looked at those two events, you say, well, they're really not too dissimilar. And in both cases, innocent people were killed. Mm-hmm. Most of the problems are caused by rulers. So your average Egyptian was just trying to eke out a living and had nothing to do whether or not the Egyptians will let go or not.
Sure.
Yet they were killed. How can you reconcile these two very similar events? On the one hand, Herod's a butcher, he did a horrible thing. On the other hand, what God did was holy and just, although does the end justify the means? I don't know. So can you just kind of reconcile those two things?
All right, Robert, you got a couple things going on here. And it is an important problem because in general, one of the things that that gets a number of people who criticize, either as atheists or as people who believe in God but don't like, what is going on in Scripture. They either case, they're going to grapple with this. And a couple questions have to be addressed. First, when you look at the episode in the book of Exodus, you see that it is something that built up gradually, in which there was a minimal amount of pain with the initial punishment and warning. The punishment was always a warning. And then it slowly tweaks up from the water into blood, frogs, then gnats, and then flies, and then boils, and darkness, and locusts, and hail. It keeps building up. And you see how at first even the magicians of Pharaoh say, no, we can do the same thing, until they get the boils themselves. At which point they then say, Pharaoh, you better listen to these guys. And Pharaoh says, okay, you can go. And then he keeps taking it back each time. So that, this gradual upbuilding is something that takes place. And then finally, as you say, the firstborn of all, firstborn males of all creatures, human and non-human, die. Now, you also see, though, and this becomes another question, that while they were not the perpetrators of the Pharaoh's own words, Pharaoh was an absolute monarch and deified. Usually after death they were deified. But there's this absolute quality of him and following him. And then the subjects of Pharaoh lose their children, as did Pharaoh. It would have made more sense just get Pharaoh and his court to lose their firstborn. But it's universal. And this then gets to another level, which is that were the Jews, well, they're not Jews at that point, they're Israelites. It's all 12 tribes. Are the Israelites executing the Egyptians? Or is it not, rather, that God, who has the issue of life and death in his hands anyway, taking their life? And this is one of the big differences between the state of somebody like Herod. But we'll get to that in a second. So that here, and this is something that everybody needs to grapple with. Does God have lordship over my life or not? And the length or shortness of my life is, and this is something that atheists would have to say, that I don't know what they would say about who has authority over life and death, unless they're in charge, as in the case of Marxism. But, we say, look, God is the one who gives life, and it is his to take. Now, from that perspective, it's not a matter of unfairness that God takes what is his to take. Whereas then we get to Herod. Herod did not give life. Neither these children nor their parents nor anybody else involved did anything to harm him. It was simply his typical paranoid sense of fear. Well, that's redundant, but that it was his paranoia. Right at the same time that he executed the boys in Bethlehem, he also executed his oldest son, and it wasn't long after that that he was about to execute his other sons. He had already executed his best friend some years before, and his favorite wife, Mariamne. And so this man was somebody who lived with his own fears of losing power, and he used murder to try and maintain it. Of course, his own death came, and he died when they just found his tomb, which is, ironically, just outside Bethlehem, at Herodian. So that's it with him. So I think the question that the atheist or agnostic must grapple with more is, does God have authority to take life or not? And then I'll just add finally, in the face of that, God did not let the Israelites gloat over the death. They had to then offer a sacrifice of their own firstborn. Now, they can't kill human beings in a sacrifice, but they had to offer a lamb or turtle doves in place of their own firstborn to remind themselves the high cost of their freedom, and that they never were allowed to gloat, and they still do not. You know, that would be a sinful thing. All right, let's take a question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
I'm with the Pittsburgh group, but I'm from Our Lady of the Miraculous Meadow in Meadowlands, PA.
Good to have you here. And your question?
Okay, I was wondering, the Roman Catholic Church has several rites, like we're in the Latin Rite, there's a Byzantine Rite.
Sure.
And how about some of the other rites in the Catholic Church?
Yeah, altogether, there are 22 rites, okay? And they have different families of rites. The Coptic and Ethiopic are two rites that are in the same basic tradition. And you also have the Armenian rite. You have a number of Byzantine rites, including Ukrainian and Melkite and Ruthenian, and a number of others. And then you also have the Syriac tradition, which includes the Maronites, Syriac Catholics, and Syro-Malankara in India, as well as the Chaldeans, who are in Iraq and in Syro-Malabar in India, the same line of tradition. So there are different families of these communities, and they're all Catholics. And if you go to any one of them, you may receive any of the sacraments there, with complete freedom. And I encourage you to do so. All right, speaking of Pennsylvania, we have James from Pennsylvania. Hello, James.
Hi, Father. God bless you.
Thank you.
My question is, what are the consistent principles and practices of just boycotting and just sanctions? For example, if the U.S. is going to sanction Russia for their, unjust aggression in Ukraine, Crimea, shouldn't we be sanctioning Communist China for their forced abortions and one-child policy and persecuting anyone against them? And so, what are the principles of just boycotting and sanctions against any country or business or individual that's doing unethical things, like newspapers that don't recognize the right to life of conceived babies? Shouldn't we be boycotting them? Thank you.
James, first of all, you offer me a big temptation. A temptation to suggest perhaps not all politicians act on the basis of principle. Sometimes the actions are done for the convenience of some of their own power, or the way they look, or being reelected, or how they appear in history. So this is one of the things. Of course, the issue of world politics and acting on principle is very complicated. I don't think that it's wise to be so deeply indebted to the tune of trillions to a country like China that not only has forced abortion, but also one of the largest slave trade realities in the world. A lot of people don't realize there are far more slaves today than in 1800. But they're not working in cotton fields. They're working in brothels. Women and children especially. So, these would be issues. And to have clear principles would be very important. But see, again, look at our government. President Obama has frequently placed a condition of getting U.S. financial support on whether or not a country accepts abortion, contraception. And now he's widening it to his next principle. one that he had one time said, marriage is a God thing, so I'm staying out of it. Now, apparently, he's taken it from God and thinks that he has to promote same-sex marriage. This is a complete opposite of what he once said in principle. And he makes that also an issue. So this is, James, you bring up a question. You're right. I would like to see us act on principle. But we have to have our principles clear. And also, at what point are we going, how much are we going to be involved in various foreign issues? At what price and what extent? These are not principles that we have worked out yet within our own country. So, this is something I think we as citizens need to make very clear, that we'd like to have principles of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness as our own freedom depended on, as principles that came from God. Remember, that's what the Declaration says. They're bestowed by the Creator, not by the state. And therefore the state can't take them. Those would be the principles I would start with and see what else we can do afterwards. I have a question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
With St. Alphonsus Liguori Parish in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Oh, great city. Good to have you here. And your question?
Regarding the canon law, the requirement of women to wear veils at Mass, that I know that changed in 83. Well, they had changes in 83, but it wasn't mentioned. Where does that stand?
Okay, when something in the 1917 code is from what I understand, when it's not mentioned, in general, it presumes that it's still in effect, unless it's specifically abrogated. But overall, in this case, it seems to be something that depends on local practice. So in some places it is practiced, others it's not, and it's left up for folks to deal with on their own locally, because the meaning of veiling varies from one culture to another. Most cultures treat it, as a very favorable thing. Some have no clue of it, and like in the South Seas Islands, it doesn't make sense. So it's been pretty much seems to be left up to the local legislation and local custom, and so that's as far as I know. I never wear one. Yes, ma'am.
Father, I have a question. As Belgium is going towards euthanasia, do you see the United States of America going toward this trend as well?
Yes. Belgium, of course, has come up with a law that you can do euthanasia to a child without the child's consent or knowledge. This is what we usually call murder. What we already have in, I believe, Oregon and Washington, that you can do euthanasia by somebody who wants to themselves. The person can agree to it. And so, yes, I see that trend developing. And again, I never will forget when Nancy Pelosi said that we have to include birth control and abortion and sterilization, because think of the money we'll save. She said that to George Stephanopoulos on, I believe it's one of those ABC News programs. And I guarantee you, if they want to kill the unborn and prevent birth to save money, when the first year of life is your second most expensive year, I guarantee you they will try to save money in your most expensive year, which is the last year of life. That's just the way I think these people think. So we have to keep an eye on them and stand up for life. All right, the Lord bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you and lead you in all of your ways by his peace, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And again, this network is brought to you by you. So please remember to keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill. And we will be able to pay all of our bills too. Thank you.